thank you very much. So, yeah, as I talked about, so I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing at Santander. So I've been there since last January. So one of the core elements is around third-party risk. And, yep, I don't think it's the most glamorous of titles. So to bring a bit of glamour into the first slide, so I'm fairly sure you all know that's Hugh Jackman playing Phileas Barnum. There is going to be no dancing, no singing from me at this moment in time. But when I was thinking about this presentation and just thinking about kind of key aspects that I wanted to look at, did a bit of research, and actually, as well as being the greatest showman, he actually first coined the phrase of jumping on the bandwagon, which was a way of getting people into the circus back in the 1800s. It was then followed by politicians who, I think Roosevelt then used it as a key tactic in terms of how we bring people with us. And the reason I've kind of gone into that is I think as a profession, we do like to jump on a bandwagon now and again. So I looked through, on the basis of this, looked through the agenda for today, and I think you've all done a great job in terms of the number of different speakers, the topics today. But looking through, there's about 60 presentations over the 2 days, of which over 60% are on these 4 topics, one of which hasn't come out very well. But so firstly around digital, so I guess there's very few events you're going to go to these days that aren't going to have some sort of digital aspect. I think I'm older and more cynical these days. I think what digital actually means to different organizations can be very different things, from being, have I got a decent source-to-pay process, all the way through to how am I putting AI, how am I actually enhancing my data. The same from a transformation. So I've developed a career out of the last 12 years out of transformation. So we love a transformation in procurement teams. So again, very much a focal point. Sustainability is very much obviously in trend at the moment, and I'm not saying that it's not a critical aspect, but I think really looking at what organizations are actually doing, as opposed to, for example, changing my LinkedIn profile. It's more about how are we making a difference to society. And then what I'm going to focus on really is around risk, and I think that's a core element that everything that's happened in the last 2 to 3 years, where there is a real burning platform, where in a previous organization, I did have a burning platform, and remember very clearly saying to a senior manager, this is the plan, this is the strategy, this is why I want a 7-figure investment. And he was, yes, this makes perfect sense, why haven't we done it before? My answer quite straightly was, because if I'd have told you a year ago, you would have never given me an investment, because you wouldn't have viewed it as important, because the landscape changes, the world changes. So really it's all about how we're going to go into that from a risk perspective. I think the reason why, and I'll go on to why I've talked about the bandwagon piece, I think there's a number of reasons why we as a profession do like to share thinking on more forward-looking matters. I think number one, it was quite interesting fact I saw from the BCG presentation earlier, that as a function, or as suppliers get about 7 minutes of our CEO's time a day. So we're all trying to fight for that board, the ExCo's visibility, and some of these are definitely the key aspects. So if I think about how the board presentations I've had to do since I've been there, the ExCo presentations, there are a lot about risk, there are about sustainability, and I think really it's about the transformation and digitization, about how we're actually enabling that to move forward. So moving on to risk and the journey we're going on in Santander. So I'm guessing that many of you in this room have felt a bit like this over the last 2.5 years. So we had COVID world, we had a post-COVID world, we have got inflation, we've got Russia, Ukraine. There are so many different factors where third-party risk has massively jumped up the agenda in most organizations. And I guess if you're thinking from an exco perspective, over and above cost, over and above many other aspects, is the thing that probably keeps them up at night in terms of actually how do we create that resilience within the organisation. But in order to do that, and I think building on that piece around bandwagon, jumping on the bandwagon, but doing it in the right way, I do think there's a big opportunity there. But I think two aspects is, number one, I think it needs to be done in a very structured, foundational type way. Just going for ad hoc ways of trying to manage certain aspects, I don't personally believe works. And I think the second bit is being relevant to your own organisation. So there are different ways that we can take some of the elements that I talked about before and make them very relevant and real for our organisations. What is real in Santander is going to be different to your organisation and different to my previous organisation. So I'm going to take you through really what we've been doing, but I think it's more about how do you adapt that to the different organisations you all operate in. So I think the first part is third parties now touch all of our organisations. So this is not about a process, it's not about a sort of more old-fashioned one-off due diligence process. It's about looking holistically about how can we look at TPRM across our whole organisation. So for us, we've looked at 6 root causes and we've got a very clear roadmap of deliverables against these. First one is around service management. So as an example, supplier management now sits as part of my organisation. But we've been really clear to differentiate between service delivery and supplier management, because we are not looking to be responsible for every single service and the delivery of service in the organisation. So what we have to do is be able to train, empower all of our business, and we've got 20,000 employees across the UK, to have the right tools to be able to manage risk in their own individual areas. Secondly, it's around the actual credibility of the risk rating. So we will all have various different assessment processes, but they are very much as good as the inputs. So you've got to make sure the inputs are very clear, very transparent, understandable, because that's what drives the credibility of the assessment. Inherent risk, so by the nature of industry, by the nature of company, inherent risks to all of our organisations are different. So really understanding what they are, and that they are coming back to this piece around relevancy. Then looking at the whole TPRM framework and infrastructure, so really the processes, the technology, and I will go on to the operating model because I do think this is a quite critical element, and it'll again bring me back to that bandwagon piece. Transparency and governance, so in terms of making everything very visible, and how do you put the right end-to-end governance processes around your activity. And then this one is a particular for us because we're quite a decentralized organization. So for those who don't know, Santander in the UK is a large retail bank, but on a global basis, we've got about 14 countries, very decentralized as an organization. So there is a lot of inter and intra-group arrangements, which from a regulatory point of view have to be dealt with exactly the same as any other supplier. So in terms of pulling together the program, what we looked at is some core design principles. So looking at how do we keep things simple. So really looking at very simple, intelligent processes. I'm not a massive fan of overcomplicating things. I think we overcomplicate the business. We talked about the fact that the supplier risk is everybody's responsibility. So actually, how do we make sure that we're enabling those service delivery owners with the right tools? Technology wouldn't be, as I said, it wouldn't be a conference if somebody wasn't talking about digitization and technology. So that's obviously going to be a key enabler. And really then around the transparency, and really generally people come to work to want to do a good job. We don't sometimes give them the right transparency, the right tools in order to do that. So how do we make sure that that is very clear and everybody understands what their role in the end-to-end process is? This one sounds quite basic, but I think I think we can get lost in the jargon of what actually is third-party risk in my organisation. So we've really started to look at what are third-party types. So it's not just third parties, as I said, it's inter and intra-group. It's fourth parties, certainly in financial services, it's a big focal point now in terms of how we're dealing with our fourth parties. What is risk? So coming back to that piece around inherent risk, these are some of the inherent risk areas within our organisation and therefore our key focal points. And then I'll go on to the operating model more, but actually operating model is more than people, it's more than technology, it's everything that comes together, it's all the ways of working, it's the culture that you create, it's the metrics you create, it's the change management around that. So bringing all of that together of what do we actually mean by TPRM. Then what we've had to do is build it really into our end-to-end source-to-pay processes and beyond. It can't be a one-off, we do this once a year, we tick the box, we move on. I think what we've all seen is that the world moves very, very quickly. The interactions we have with providers change on a continuous basis, and this needs to be fully embedded into our ways of working. So whether it's in sourcing, whether it's in the contracting process, whether it's in initial planning stages, really trying to look at that end-to-end risk scenario all the way from I need something onto the ongoing supplier management. Coming back to the tech point, so this is our technology landscape. The one thing I would, and I'm sure somebody will be trying to sell me some technology today, but the one thing I would say, all of these are not the same tool. So I think there are ways that you can integrate all of your technology landscape together without it being a single instance, because I don't think there is a provider out there who can provide best of breed in all of these different aspects. So really, I'm not going to go into every detail, but certainly we've got a supplier risk tool, which is very much creating that framework and infrastructure, and that's being supported by some added enhancements about how we're using big data. From a supplier performance and supplier collaboration, so we've got tools where we're creating a lot more transparency and visibility across the organisation so that we've got a holistic single view of the relationship. And then also building in from a contract management perspective and the sourcing management, how is that all being enabled within that? But making it feel, certainly from a user perspective, that everything is integrated, even though, as I said, there are 4 different companies involved in those different tools at the moment. And then just coming on to the operating model. So anybody who I'm connected with on LinkedIn, actually I've had some debates about this recently, and this is where I think I come back to the bandwagon piece. So our actual operating model looks like this, where we have obviously the supply partners are in the center because they're obviously the critical element. What we own from my organisation generally, but also we've got risk experts in the organisation, plus we've got second line risk functions who support that, is the actual operating model, the strategic direction, the policy, how that's going to work. We have a risk operations team we've got our own captive within Santander, so that sits within our captive organisation, but they are driving the process, they're driving the completion of tasks, they're driving the triage, but really about generating efficiency, generating effectiveness, so that our risk experts can see the wood for the trees as much as anything. We want people with true risk expertise focusing on the 20%, not the 80%. And so really getting that working as an operation. And then also, as I said, we've got a technology platform, RiskSmart, which is looking at the end-to-end, but it's not just looking at a supplier basis, looking at an engagement basis. But in terms of that overall operating model, and I guess particularly focused on the Santander part, I think one of the debates I'd had is kind of you are what you eat. And even though we all come to events and we'll all say sustainability is critical, and we'll say digital is critical and transformation is critical, unless I'm doing something very wrong, everybody in this room has got scarce resources and everybody in this room is under pressure. about where do I put those scarce resources, and really trying to look at what do we want to be famous for. And I think if people are probably more honest with themselves sometimes and look in the mirror, if you're saying sustainability is the most important thing in the world to you, but 3% of your resources actually are fully 100% dedicated to sustainability, it probably tells a slightly different message. And I think it's what we've tried to do is think about where can we make the biggest difference? What do we want to be famous for? It's not that we're not doing all the other aspects, but it's actually how are we going to structure our organisation in order to be able to deliver what the business needs are for the next few years. Personal view, and again, I'll try and be a little bit challenging here, is that we've often in procurement tried to create this person where we put everything under category management, and we want them to be the best at negotiating, and we want them to be the best supplier managers, and we want them to be the best risk person and the best at analytics. And the reality is they don't exist. And even if they do exist, they never have the time or the headspace to be able to do those things. So it's about really how we've tried to then put division of responsibility, the division of the tasks, but again, making it feel like a single integrated function. So then just looking at our overall operating model, this is kind of how we've split our team. So within the team, we've probably got 110-ish people. Around 40% of our team are focused 100% on either supplier collaboration. So I've got probably over 20 people who are absolutely dedicated supplier management. And we've changed the title because I didn't want it to be the old view of vendor management. It's about actually how are we creating more partnerships, how we're collaborating with partners moving forward. And then also in the third-party risk and supplier governance piece, so between those two areas, we've got in the region of 40%. We've obviously also got category and sourcing activities. We've got some, we issued our quarterly statement yesterday. Costs have gone down. We've got a huge cost program running, so it is a critical part of our business, but it's also trying to right-size the business for the future as opposed to what it just is today. And then also, we've got proposition and the enablement, which is really the enablement of everything. The proposition is all around what do we want, what I talked about in terms of what do we want to be famous for, what's those moments that matter when people are interacting with the organisation. And I'm not saying necessarily I've got the right answer for Santander even, never mind about your own organisations, because I'm fairly sure that we will do some ups and downs in terms of things we've got right, things that we need further evolution on. But I think what we tried to do is make a very brave move in terms of we're not going to try and create a huge category management team, because actually that isn't where the future of the organisation is. That isn't what is keeping our board up at night. And therefore, how do we start to really develop those partnerships, which in turn drive a lot of incremental value anyway across the organisation. And then just finally, one final slide is then also, I've kind of talked earlier on the technology landscape about the more basics, if you like. Obviously, there's a huge amount of data, and I think risk is an area where there's some great opportunities, and we're in the process of implementing something within Santander, but this was a tool I implemented in a previous organisation that really is then very much focused on the inherent risk in our organisation. How do we scrape as much information from the World Wide Web as we possibly can, bring that in, get rid of false positives, and then be able to overlay that with our data. So in a COVID world, for example, and actually a good example with Russia and Ukraine recently, we were very quickly able to identify where our exposure was on a third party, and to an extent on a fourth party. We were in a pretty good position on that by focusing on, as I talked about earlier, focusing on getting the foundations right. The tech foundations were there, and then we've overlaid it with further enhancements in order to really focus on the challenges that we face as an organisation, which in turn, obviously, as I said, will be very different to all of your organisations. And then that was it. So just perfectly on time as well. So thank you very much.
That was fascinating.
I wouldn't go that far, but
No, great slides as well. I have a couple of questions, but mine can wait. We've got a full room, so would anyone like to chime in?
clearly covered it all.
I think you covered off everything, and that's the issue. So there's two main questions I have. First is actually about your last slide. That looks to me like most AI ML sort of platforms. I just wonder though, specifically within supply chain, when you're developing your own, is this something that you would use in conjunction with others out there? Because
so it wasn't a tool we've developed ourselves. It's an external tool, but I think the important thing is then how do you tailor it to your organization? So we've done, without going into too much boring detail, a lot of work around our inherent risk against our taxonomy, our category. I don't want to know everything that's happened to Deloitte in this area, this area, this area, because it's irrelevant to me. So actually, how do we do that? How do we take away some of those false positives as part of that ongoing solution? And obviously through NLP and machine learning, building that back into the solution. But I will be honest, we also had eyeballs at the end of it that are then also looking to say, that's still not correct, that's still not correct. So, but it's very much about how we tailored it. So again, that wood for the trees analogy, when we do really get the alerts in, it is an actual issue as opposed to 50 alerts that I just don't have time to actually look at anything.
Yeah. When you look at the risk prediction platforms out there, and I want to just focus on risk, as a financial institution who will have a specialty in risk, do they complement your own, or do you view it as we sort of need to have that in-house?
What, in terms of complement what we already have?
Yeah, and I don't just mean what you have in terms of technology or what you hope to develop, but what you have as in terms of the brain trust.
Careful what I say here. So I've not worked in financial services before, and I think financial services is particularly special in terms of how regulated it is and how the models work in terms of first line of defence, second line of defence. So I think there's a balancing act, and we work very, very closely with the risk functions, for example. So so off the back of some of the things I showed you, we've got a plan about 25 different deliverables. All of that is done absolutely in conjunction with second line. All of it is very much verified with them. We're at our executive risk committee monthly, on a certainly quarterly basis, feels like monthly at the moment. But so yes, so I think there's a lot of knowledge within our organisation that we're able to bring to fruition to look at third parties. The actual ownership of that all sits with us, and so it all sits with me, but it's then using the right people in the organisation to be able to support that, with I guess some of the key elements being cyber, which is obviously a massive thing to us, and financial crime is a significant area as well.
Now, within your own division, I'm just wondering, do you tackle things with working groups, and are they small? Is it sort of 4 people? How are teams divided?
In terms of?
Just how you approach it.
But in terms of what? Problem solving?
In terms of problem solving, in terms of dealing with multiple functions and making it look like one. So the super individual that you had up there.
It's more about the ways of working. So, and again, I've been there a year and a quarter. It's some of the work we're still doing, but it's all about how, what's that single point of contact from a business point of view? What's the, as I said, those moments that matter from a business perspective? Who are they talking to, and how do you get that ways of working very integrated? So if you think about, let's say, a category, we've split a category into 3 different sections. We have upfront, the strategic element, we have sourcing execution, and we have supply management, but it all sits under my leadership team across 3 different areas. So in effect, it is one single integrated team who is working as the functional representation out to the business.
Excellent. We have a question on the front. Emily will bring the microphone to you. I saw 7 or 8 hair sweeps, which aren't quite graduating into hands up yet, but I'm sure they will. Please introduce yourself.
I know him anyway.
Hello. Hi, Nick. But hello, everyone else. I'm Rob from BP, Rob Bonner. Hi. I was interested in the bit you said about putting your money where your mouth is. Right? So saying, actually, you've put 40% of the people on vendor management or the future of risk, yeah?
Yeah.
And then just in the last answer, you talked about the structure there where you've got category, ops, and then risk, yeah? So if you've got 40% in risk, what's your balance with the other two bits? How have you structured? Because you said about right sizing for the future, and I was really interested in what you're thinking around there.
It's not just risk though, because I would say the supplier collaboration partners do drive a lot of value as well. It drives value in a different way in terms of how you're managing that ongoing relationship. So, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. 20% in the upfront category, 25% in execution, somewhere in that region, I would say.
Okay.
But it was, I know exactly, because the conversations we've had with their very distinct roles, and we've made sure we've separated out that, because as I said, I just don't believe that this person who can do everything and juggle all those balls in the air actually exists. And I think we end up bringing it back to a talent conversation where we sit there and say, we haven't got the right talent, and it's not we haven't got the right talent, it's we've got the wrong operating model. A lot of the time, it's just we're trying to put square pegs into round holes, and it just doesn't work.
Excellent. Anything else from the floor? Not yet. From online, do you feel Santander is now more prepared for global risks than it was before COVID?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think everybody is. I wasn't there in a pre-COVID environment, but I think the reality is, if I think about my previous organisation, that was a very clear conversation that I'd had, that had I have gone and asked for a 7-figure investment, which I did a year previously, I would not have got it. I am under no illusions, and even though that senior manager said, yeah, we would have listened and we would have absolutely given it to you, you had to create that burning platform, and risk is obviously something that until you've experienced the problem, it's very much about it's someone else's problem, it's something else that might happen, it's never happened to us. And I think what's happened certainly in the last 2 years is it's not just been COVID, it's been one thing after another, after another, after another, and hence why I'm back at the exec risk committee on a quarterly basis, because they are very, very focused on risks within our supply base, and we get a lot of scrutiny. This is not a 5-minute presentation. There is a huge amount of scrutiny that goes into it, and what are we doing and how are we doing it, and what's the different building blocks we're putting in place.
Yeah, I think that's the must-have transformation, but everyone's I think experienced.
Which is why I guess my point on that, the 4 different areas, I think it's an area where there is a real burning platform, and I think it's the right time that people can really start to look at how do we create added value through supplier management and through supplier risk across the organisation, because we either embrace it or the world moves on and something else will come along, and therefore we'll face other challenges in the future.
And I think that's a very confident and coherent note to end on. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you.